about paper to digital, and only 12, 15 years later, we have all this AI stuff going on. And so we also run a large community practice with about 2,000 people who are thinking about this intersection of monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning, and technology. I think up to now, most of the sessions that we saw that are happening at the conference are very much focused on AI adoption. And we want to really start flipping it and think about how do we evaluate AI, both internal adoption in our organizations, but when we're doing programming that includes AI, whether that's AI in health, AI in mental health, AI in agriculture, all the different AI in all the different segments here. And so today we're going to focus on a smaller part of that, which is challenge funds. There are a lot of challenge funds that are being issued. And so I'm here with two colleagues who are Ruth from the GSMA Foundation, who is actually implementing and doing MEL on challenge funds for the GSMA Foundation. And then my colleague Emeka at the MEL Tech Initiative, who is working with Masakane Foundation to develop a MEL framework for their African language AI program. Missing, unfortunately, today is our colleague Mariela, who is leading an IEEE Challenge Fund in 2 countries, in Lesotho and the Gambia. We have a colleague here from IEEE who's going to make sure we say everything right on Mariela's behalf. And so, yeah, we really want to get into, get deeper into these questions of, what should we be monitoring? When should we be doing different types of MEL? Is an RCT the only thing that we should be doing? What are the other points in time that we could be evaluating? What about small organizations who don't have budgets for big evaluations? Like all these big questions, we're really trying to crack the nut of what is right-sized MEL for challenge funds and hopefully for other types of AI-enabled programming. So I'm going to hand off over first to Emeka. One of the things we've also been thinking quite a lot about is what are the enabling environments that are required in order for successful AI program implementation to happen. So I guess going first to you, Emeka, do you want to tell us a little bit about your work? And then what are some of the enabling factors that you're looking at?
Sure. Thank you, Linda, and thanks. Really lovely to be here. Just to start off with a quick context for those who don't know, Masakane is a community-led effort that is building the infrastructure needed for African communities to participate meaningfully in the AI economy. And we are partnering with them, MTI, essentially to evaluate the challenge fund that is focused on African language AI innovation, funded by the Gates Foundation. While also trying to understand how ecosystem building effort shifts participation, institutional norms, and AI governance across Africa over time. And to evaluate their work, we first developed what we're calling theory of influence. It's not your standard theory of change, because what Masakane is doing, building AI ecosystem, doesn't follow the linear cause and effects logic, right? And part of why we also chose building a theory of influence is because there are different project-specific TOCs can then be nested within the TOI, that's the theory of influence. Now, what is interesting about the work with Masakane is that it forces you to rethink what we actually mean by an enabling environment for AI in Africa, right? When people talk about enabling environments for GenAI, the conversation usually starts with infrastructure or connectivity, electricity, devices, and sometimes it moves to regulation and AI policy, right? Now, those things are important and they do matter, but if you strip it down to the first principles, one fundamental enabling condition that determines whether GenAI becomes inclusive or extractive is power and agency. Okay, and one of the things we are trying to do in the evaluation framework we are developing for Masakani is to add questions of ownership, questions of stewardship, and value capture over time, because inclusion in GenAI cannot simply mean using the tools. Okay, and that's what we are realizing. Now, because if the data comes from, say, a community in Nigeria or in Kenya, but ownership and the economic return sits elsewhere, say in London or in Silicon Valley, then we should be honest to really say whether the model is not just structurally inclusive in any meaningful way. And that's part of what we are trying to integrate. So what makes Masakani interesting is that it is trying to build a genuinely community-steered approach to AI development in Nigeria. Now, whether that succeeds is an empirical question, but it's precisely the kind of question we should be evaluating.
Thanks, Emeka. And turning over to you, Ruth, and you're sitting inside of the GSMA Foundation and you're supporting your teams that are running challenge funds. And I think when we think about evaluating AI, we keep thinking, oh, chatbots, right? But there's AI everywhere, and AI is not only chatbots. And a lot of the evaluation there's about one evaluation framework that's kind of out there right now that is very focused on chatbots and very focused on technical evaluation. And so we've been partnering to think through, what do you do about all these other kinds of AI? How do we evaluate those kinds of AI? How do we evaluate AI that's not a chatbot? And so, Ruth, you've been thinking a lot about that, and if you can talk to us about the kinds of things you're funding through the Challenge Fund and how you're, maybe some of the challenges and the ways that you're thinking about evaluation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Linda. And hello, everyone. It's great to be here. So GSMA, for those who may not know who we are the global body of telecoms. And so the foundation within GSMA is the Mobile for Development Foundation. And we sit at the intersection of MNOs and digital tech. And how we sort of see that guiding our principles is that we try and advance meaningful impact through digital and emerging technologies. So related to what Emeka was talking about, when we consider the enabling environment, we really consider the enabling environment in 3 different ways. And we've structured our challenge funding along these 3 lines. And we're operating under the hypothesis, which I would stress, really, we want to test it and pull it apart, is that under the right conditions, AI can accelerate impact in a meaningful way for people who are underserved and vulnerable and marginalized. And so there's lots to sort of tease apart there. And when we think about that enabling environment, we think about it firstly in terms of the accessibility and the inclusion of the types of AI-based solutions that we fund and hope to scale once the impact is proven. We also think about the role at this higher level where Emeka is sort of pointing to, of all the different players. And point to that, but also it's the research institutions and the innovators who we support through the Challenge Fund. So when we talk about this group of grantees, we are funding private sector startups in low and middle income context. And previously, when we've done it, because the Innovation Fund at GSMA has been happening for about 6 years now, this is the first AI focus round we've ever done. And prior to this, we've had a really clear thematic focus. So it would have been climate resilience or digital inclusion. This time, we've looked specifically at AI without a sector focus. And organically, what's happened as a result of that is that we have 9 very different grantees, and none of them are chatbot based when they think about the solutions that they're developing, which has opened up a whole can of worms when we think about the tools that we're using to evaluate the impact of the AI. And that's really core for us because, again, if we think back to our hypothesis that the reason that we're funding AI in the first place is because we want to leverage its opportunity to reduce barriers to access for already meaningful solutions, we really want to understand why, how, and who's excluded from that. So I think about the range of grantees that we're funding right now. We're funding 2 deep techs who are doing language accessibility in Nepal and Morocco. We've got 1 health tech who's looking at maternal scanning through ultrasounds in rural Morocco. We've got 3 edtechs based between Pakistan, Indonesia, and Ghana, and they're all sort of using AI in very, very different ways. And a couple others that I won't mention because we're going to run out of time. But the main thing that we're grappling with is 2 or 3-fold. The first is when we talk about the evaluation framework that's currently out there, it's been an amazing resource for us as a starting point because, again, we're looking at really different AI applications. And so the same thing is not going to work in each case. But also the accessibility of the solution to the users that they're hoping to reach is not going to work in every case. So the structure was very helpful for us in terms of thinking through how do we assess and evaluate the model? Is it working? Is it accurate? Is it providing the right types of information that's relevant? And then moving to this next level of looking at the product and how people use it. Are people using it for the things that the company is expecting them to use it for? And then we start thinking about impacts. Okay, so when you are using it, what happens as a result? But what we learned very quickly is that both the type of AI, the need that the innovators have to build it, and the back end of everything that goes into that, very, very different based on the use case. And so the tools that are available were not really working. We've really had to innovate as we go. And I would say we're very early in this process. The grantees have been active for about 3 or 4 months, and we've just had the first round of data in using the tools that we've developed for this purpose. And it's very much an open book, iterative process. What we learned in the first instance is that the effectiveness of the models vary substantially, which means that the effectiveness of the grantee's ability to understand the ethical risks, who's going to be able to access the service and what effect that may have on their life varies dramatically as well. So we've developed one tool that we're using just to look at the model and how are they thinking about whether or not the information the model provides has biases, has ethical concerns, has risk involved, and then what the accuracy of that model is. And it essentially is a menu of questions that the grantees will submit information about every quarter. And it asks them, what is the indicator, what's the equation that you are using to test your model in a variety of different ways. And what we've seen already in the first iteration is that some grantees who are much further along in the maturity scale, they're able to answer those questions. And some of them really are not. And the thing that is, I think, most interesting and most important when we're seeing these differences and these trends is that where the use case for the AI is really clear. So in the case of, for example, our language grantees, the 2 who are doing language accessibility in Nepal and Morocco, they've got this nailed because for them, they've built a solution entirely around this. But where the AI is built on top of something else, on top of a digital tech solution, maybe it's looking at students trying to prepare for exams, the role of the AI and the impact pathway and the role of what the AI is trying to do is not always clear. And when that's the case, our grantees are facing a lot of challenges in trying to verify the model itself and how the model is going to be affecting its users. So that's something that we're very conscious of and that we're working through consistently with the business that we're supporting.
Thank you. So there's so many, I feel like there's so many layers to think through when you're talking about AI. I want to speak on behalf of Mariela, which she gave me her permission to, and talk a little bit about the challenge fund that IEEE is running. And so they're working in Lesotho and Gambia. One of their main interests is really, can we work in such a way that we can ensure that government would pick up the type of tool or the type of AI application? So it's a challenge fund that's looking at an agriculture chatbot, an agriculture extension chatbot in Lesotho, partnering with the FAO and partnering with the government of Lesotho. And then the second one is in the Gambia, partnering with WHO, partnering with government of the Gambia. Underlying the tech stack is an open source tech stack that the ITU is developing. So the idea is to create these AI chatbots based on this open tech stack that the ITU has developed, which is open source, work together with governments, with FAO, with WHO, lots of partners, and trying to figure out at what stage and how do we engage government offices, government ministries in this process so that there's a handover at some point. And it's not a handover at the very end, like, oh, we did this cool thing over here, take it. But really, how do you engage and involve government along the way? And also, how do you involve government at the right time? In the same way that how do you evaluate the chatbot or the AI tool at the right time? We don't want to waste anyone's time with lots and lots of meetings and spinning. So our colleagues at FAO and WHO are kind of leading on that government engagement process. And then there are folks that are leading on the tech development process. And so one of the things that ITU has, that IEEE has been very thoughtful around is it's a short-term project. We're not going to be evaluating impact, but what we're going to be doing is trying to, and I think this morning someone talked about field notes or, over case studies, or what is all the learning that can happen in this process? We already know a lot from our ICT for D days, our M for D days. Is there anything different about AI for development, or are we going to relearn all the same lessons? And so what are some of the ways that we can document these processes? Is AI different, or is AI kind of another round of engagement with governments around potential for sustainability and scale of these tools through a government option. And I say we because one of the roles that we're playing as Moral Tech Initiative is we're supporting with those learning reports and that learning agenda with the IEEE. And so, kind of going back to some of our other questions, there's been I think a really big focus on, can we get the perfect tool? Can we get a tool that is using the right model, that's not hallucinating, that's not going off script, that's not harmful? And I think a lot of the, or potentially some of the ways that we're evaluating AI, especially AI chatbots, is in this kind of clinical environment, in this little box over here, making sure that we get everything right here. Or we're throwing it out into the community with no safeguards and hoping that it works, and we'll figure out what's bad about it once it gets thrown into the world and we cause harm. And so I'm curious, sort of, what are some of the elements that you're thinking about, Ruth, when you're thinking about what is this environment? What are the things that might speak towards impact in the early stages before you're doing something more specific around an impact evaluation?
Yeah, thanks. I think one of the main things that we think about, again, going back to under what context and under what conditions can AI prove impactful, is what else is going on in the environment that this AI solution will be deployed in. If you have an AI solution that's perfectly functioning, but the infrastructure through which the users will need to go to get the support that they need in a tangible way doesn't work, then the impact is effectively nil anyways. If we take, for example, the grantee that we have in Morocco, which is doing neonatal and maternal scans, we have a lot of questions, and a lot of our focus from a MEL perspective around that is, if we assume that the model works perfectly, can a woman in rural Morocco access the healthcare that she needs when she has the information from this scan? And so understanding the contextual factors that are involved there is a really key point for us. And we apply that to all of the grantees that we're thinking about. I think the other one that we pay strong attention to is around the risk of exclusion. We fund several grantees that have a financial inclusion element to them. And one of the main things we think about is, what does AI or predictive analytics around things like credit look like, and for who? And who may be left behind, and who may be included that maybe is not ready to take on a loan, for example. So thinking about the different directions that AI and the decision the AI can take or can lead you to, and whether that's going to be inclusive, positive, and have sort of a broader impact is really important. And we work really closely with our grantees around it. And for them, it's also very top of mind. And thinking about, okay, what is the type of proxy information that you're feeding into your models? Where does the data come from? And looking at, and this is also, as an aside, where a lot of the input of the mobile network operators come in. Where we've seen these successful partnerships is where MNOs in the countries with the grantees are able to sort of support them in terms of feeding data into their models. And that's sort of a really interesting, I think, dynamic around that. So yeah, I think the context for us is everything as we sort of look to unpick, what are the right conditions, or what is the enabling environment for impact through AI? And I would say it's the same types of questions you would ask for impact through digital. There's not that much that's different in terms of the questions you ask. It's just that the mechanisms and what you see as a result may change.
Thank you so much. And Emeka, I know you've spent time trying to work with some of the Challenge Fund grantees and figure out what are the right kinds of indicators and at what stage you're going to be asking for different types of information. And so you have product stage indicators, and then you have these kind of impact indicators later. And how has it been for you working with the Challenge Fund partners, the recipients of these funds, and how are you involving them in defining those metrics and those indicators? And what are some of the important things that you're looking at in terms of how well these different types of I think they're both chatbots or, sort of, community facing or clinical, clinic facing, kind of frontline worker facing tools. What kinds of things are you thinking about and looking at?
So it's still early days because we are co-creating some of these MEL systems with these grantees, Masakani grantees, building out different things. And at the moment, they have identified two use case organization, and they are working towards identifying another two that will focus on livelihood. The other two already identified and onboarded is looking at health. But Ruth touched on something important, and I want to build on it with a framing that has always been central to our work with Masakani. And there's a phrase I keep coming back to, that a tool, an AI tool, that works is not the same as a tool that matters, right? And this is some of the things that are bubbling up, especially when you look at the Gen for development space. I think we are still spending more time on the first question than the second, understandably so. For instance, in our work with Masakani, three things kind of keep showing up. And interestingly, all three are ultimately about people, not technology. Now, the first is gender and assets. If you take a maternity health assistant, and one of the use case organization is really focusing on that, targeting is called Help Mom, targeting pregnant women, and of course, children for vaccination as well. Now, if a maternal health assistant is being delivered through WhatsApp or voice AI, technically that tool may work perfectly in any local language, right? Whether it's Hausa in Nigeria or Swahili in the Southern Africa. But in many households in Sub-Saharan Africa, the phone is shared, all right? And which means privacy is also shared too, some way, okay? So a woman may avoid using the tool, not because it's not useful, but because asking certain health questions in a shared environment may carry social risk, if you ask any typical woman. So from the outside, that AI product can perform well technically, but socially, okay, adoption never really happens. And if you don't sort of design the evaluation framework or your MEL framework to be able to capture that reality, we will mistake technical performance for real inclusion. Okay, and that's the same thing occurs when you talk about trust, all right? And what we are seeing with Masakani partners is that trust is not the same thing as accuracy, all right? Which means trust itself has to become part of the evaluation, and we need to ask people directly, do you trust this tool? Have you used it? If not, why not? Okay, and that's part of what we are beckoning to that whole process of building out the MEL framework or the evaluation framework. And the third factor I want to raise is about awareness. And I think there is a huge difference between a tool existing and the community actually knowing it actually exists, right? Especially in many of the environments where these challenge funds will operate, okay? Mali, some places in the northern part of Nigeria that are quite rural, right? And you would not find an AI product discovered through, say, app stores or Google search, right? In most cases, it's actually introduced through trusted intermediaries, a teacher, a community health worker, local radio station, an extension worker. Now, those frontline workers are the infrastructure of adoption. And if we are not evaluating those pathways, we are missing a huge part of the story. And for me, a MEL framework or evaluation frameworks for GenAI Challenge Funds are still evolving. We know that. In many cases, I think we are actually building the plane while flying it. But conversations like this is quite important because they help us move from the question of whether technology works to whether it's actually being trusted and used in practice.
Super important. I think one of the points that you raise is really dear to some other work that we're doing, which is related to formative research and digital design. And sometimes in this pathway of developing tools, we're starting with, a tool over here without really understanding what are the use patterns of the community? Are they sharing phones? How do women access phones? What kinds of phones? Do people have electricity? Do they have enough data to use an AI tool? There's so many of the contextual and local and cultural factors, social norms, gender equity, all of these things that I feel like we've forgotten that that's important. And people are jumping in again, once more, to design tools without having done the research about what kind of tool is needed, or do we even need a tool? Do we even need AI? Is there a better way to do this? Should we be doing something completely different and not even thinking about technology? And so I think one of the things we've been advocating for is this formative research, this digital design piece that should precede and then link into the evaluation framework. And so that kind of some of the challenges you're mentioning, Emeka, are women sharing phones? Do they have privacy? Are there social norms that prohibit them or that make them feel they have less agency? We could know a lot of that if we did our digital design and our formative research before we design something, and then maybe we would design a tool that's more adequate for the population that we're trying to support. And so I think that's a really critical piece. I know Mariela would love to be here and also talk about, again, these relationships with government. So what is the readiness, the AI readiness, if you're thinking of scaling through a government? What does the AI readiness look like within that government? Who is going to kind of take this project on? Which ministry, which team within government? Is it the ag team if you're working with ag? Is the ag team saying, well, no, we're not the ICT team, so you go talk to the other team? Like, how are we thinking through AI readiness if we're on that kind of partnership with all these different agencies, and we're hoping that, a government might be the scale pathway, making sure that government's involved from the beginning and making sure that there are point people within government that can, that kind of carry this along, and that are, if necessary, that are strengthening their own capacities along the way in terms of rolling out and working with AI tools. We have a few more minutes, and what we really wanted to do to make it really worth your while to come to our session is share some actual frameworks that that Ruth and Emeka are working on. So I'm going to put yours up first, Emeka. And you can go ahead, and if you remember what you designed up here, because you can't see it.
Yeah, I do. So in building the Masakani evaluation framework, we brought together three things. The AI evaluation playbook, that I think is CD Dev and the agency fund that is behind it. We brought the OECD DAC thinking and a strong focus on power, agency, and inclusion, right? Now, for those who are aware of the AI evaluation playbook, it actually comes from a product development logic, which essentially says you have to start with model evaluation, then product evaluation, and then user and impact evaluation. Now, in a pure AI development context, that sequence makes sense. You build, you test, you optimize, you deploy. That makes sense. But in a development evaluation context, we usually don't start with whether something works, right? We start with whether we are solving the right problem for the right community in the right context. So for us, we thought we needed to make a deliberate choice to reorder the framework, the AI evaluation playbook. Not because the AI logic is wrong, but because the evaluation questions change depending on where you start. Okay, and as you can see, our own framework sort of we still engage the stages in the AI playbook, the 4 stages, but we made a methodological decision to switch the early stages around. So instead of starting with model, we started with products. And that's why you see we start with right things to right ways and then right results, because this way we will be able to do an end-to-end evaluation, which is what Masakani wanted. That covers everything from technical performance to adoption conditions to organizational readiness, ecosystem factors. And remember, they work to galvanize and stimulate the ecosystem. So it's important that we are measuring that. And then when we can come to impact, we expanded the definition to include questions about the broader AI landscape. Now, I want to say that the evaluation framework is premised on the theory of influence or theory of change that we had to reconstruct for them, right? So essentially, we will end up doing a theory-based evaluation that we've layered another methodology on top called contribution analysis. So we are not doing the classical RCT because the challenge fund is time-bound, it's 2 years. And there are so many factors you need to take into account to do an RCT. One of it is the time. And 2 years is not sufficient to be able to do that. And then the resources and the statistical power and all those sort of things. So we've thought it's important to do a theory-based one with contribution analysis, looking at quasi-experimental approach. The other conversation we are now having with them, especially with Masakani and Gates Foundation, because we are using a specific challenge fund called ECHO, funded by Gates Foundation, to experiment this framework, is to see how we can incorporate cost effectiveness analysis, like a value for money analysis, to be able to say, if you spend $10 building an app, for example, how much does it translate in terms of social return on investment, and then put a cost to that. We haven't built that in yet because it's still a conversation. And once we agree on something, then we'll try and integrate that as well into our framework. So essentially, this is our framework.
Thank you. And over to you, Ruth, if you want to talk about yours.
Sure. Emeka, your framework is beautiful. So ours is also, I would hesitate to call this a framework, and I would call it more of an approach. Again, we have 9 very different grantees, and we're very much building as we go. It is also grounded in the evaluation playbook. And I think I will, before I even start talking about this, I will pick up on one point that you mentioned, Emeka, which is the role of RCTs. I think there's a big discussion and debate about where, when, what types of solutions, who will fund these RCTs. At GSMA, we're engaged in one at the moment, and it is with a solution that Viamo developed in Pakistan, which is an anticipatory IVR-based service, GenAI response for disaster information. It's a good candidate for this, or we believe it's a good candidate for this, because the solution has been around for 4 or 5 years, and it's built on previous iterations of Viamo's Ask Viamo Anything model. And Viamo is a great partner for this. They're very willing to open their books, tinker with the tool, really look at sort of the exact logs of what people ask and how long they spend asking, and what types of services and information is required. They've done several studies before building up to the RCT. And so when we get to this point and we're able to test different treatment arms, it makes sense as a solution. It also has the reach. It's covered over 100,000 people in terms of engagement. Our other grantees are not in this position at all. And so we very strongly push back on doing RCTs. And similar to what Emeka is saying, our grant cycle is 18 months. And we do keep in touch with our grantees, and we do longitudinal studies, but we typically wouldn't do this for a further 2 years minimum. And that's both to allow the impact to mature, if it is going to mature at all, but also because our grantees often don't have the user bases. They're a tool that's early into market. And so when you're going to do an RCT with 2,000 people total, like, it's not going to tell you anything. The other thing, which I will get into this now, but is really key that I mentioned earlier, is really understanding what the AI does in the impact pathway before you even consider something as large scale as an RCT. And I do definitely think they have their place. So when we consider the approach that we're using, and I've tried to outline some of the tools that we're using as well, because I know that's been a real struggle for us to kind of think about, okay, these are the questions we're trying to answer, but what tools are we using to do that? We think about 4 things and we really see them as building into each other. So the first is the ecosystem as a whole that I mentioned earlier. And when we think of the ecosystem, it's the user, the innovator, and sort of this broader context and who plays what role and what types of partnerships can create an enabling environment. And that combination and who does what in the value chain is really important for us in thinking about how do you make a space where if an AI solution is going to function well, it can scale and you can reach more people. The second really speaks to this AI playbook framework. So is the AI solution technically robust? And here we really want to stress test what comes out of it. Is it accurate? Is it relevant? Is it giving people the information they need? And what exclusionary proprieties or what inequalities may it be exacerbating? And so to do that, we have the AI checklist, which I mentioned earlier, which is a tool that we are constantly developing and redeveloping based on our grantees' needs. And we also collect regular data, and we do baseline and end lines for our grantees as well. That covers that too. Sorry. Then we look at how the AI may or may not reduce barriers to access to impactful solutions. And this is where we see that longer term study come in. So for us, this is where we go back at the end of the grant, if the solution and the grantee is mature enough for that, or a year or 2 later. This is also where we look at that contextual analysis piece about what the rest of the system where this AI tool may be functioning looks like, and how accessible are the services that people need once they've used the AI tool. Is that there and in place? And then finally, a big focus area for GSMA's Innovation Fund that we have across all of our rounds is on scalability. And we think this is important because if you find an AI solution that can have impact in a lot of low middle income contexts and global contexts for that matter, the things that you need to scale that solution, whether that's access to compute or GPUs or cloud or any kind of other infrastructure, is hard to come by. So when we work with our grantees, we work a lot on, do you have the technical expertise that you need to grow this? How do you need to partner with a mobile network operator so that you can think about scale? What kind of cloud-based access do you need and how are you going to fund that? So I think that's kind of the next step, and that's sort of why we have it at the very end. Once those solutions are tested and proven, do you have the mechanisms in place and the resources that you need to grow them? Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I hope that you found those really concrete examples useful in how you're thinking about your own potential either deployment of AI tools, because I think when we deploy things, we want to think about all these aspects that would help us know if they're succeeding, right? So I think these are really useful ways to think about planning and designing tools themselves, as well as planning and designing evaluation. So we're going to open it up to questions now. I'm not sure how much longer the session goes. We started about 10 minutes late. I'm hoping they'll let us keep our 10 minutes. Yes, awesome. So we have about 10, 15 minutes, maybe 10 minutes for questions. So I saw a hand way in the back go up first. So maybe we can start back there.
Thanks for those thoughts. My name is Maureen Masharia. I work with Spindle Design. We do a lot of adoption research, and this is very relevant to the work that we do. My question is, you mentioned measuring conditions for sustained results. And so in your view, what do you think are some of the leading indicators for sustained adoption that we should be looking out for? I understand that all of this is new and it's evolving, but what should we be keeping an eye out for?
I'll just say one of the things that that we're working on is looking at what are the product metrics that could indicate or provide some insight into what might be uptake, and thinking about the cyclical nature. So for example, if you're designing, and this is going to a chatbot situation, if you're designing a tool that's meant for pregnant women, you wouldn't expect them to use that tool, every single day for 10 years, because they're probably not pregnant every single day for 10 years, right? So thinking about the cyclical nature of adoption of tools and the daily use of tools and kind of your product metrics. And I think also looking at some of how engaged are those conversations, but not overly engaged. And I know you have thoughts on that one as well, Ruth, but maybe some of these kind of indications that there is uptake and that there is some type of behavior that's pointing towards the fact, whether this tool or this underlying AI is actually being used and is leading towards something. Yeah, you want to?
Yeah, I can add one thing, which is that one of the things that we're seeing is a conflation between the product metrics and the impact metrics. So use doesn't, or sustained use or number of hours spent on a service doesn't always mean that the service is having the impact. And where we've seen this example most clearly is in the ed tech space, where if you have a student studying for something and then we have a grantee telling us, oh, but they're spending hours on the chatbot. And you're like, well, how many hours do they need to be spending studying for this exam? Like what? They could be doing something else on the chatbot, or like, have we looked at this? What does this look like? So I think having a real differentiation between is the tool functioning, which is your product metric, and is that what you want, which is your impact metric, and that's definitely something that we've been seeing.
Maybe I think there was one up towards the front, yeah, and we'll stick around after if people want to come up and chat with people after. So yeah, I thank you.
Hi, I'm Rosie Emerson. I'm a principal investigator at Ladderite. We do social impact research and evaluation. Thank you so much for this session. Emeka, you've just saved me a LinkedIn post with a 4-level framework. I was always like, the model doesn't come first. So thank you so much for sharing that. I have a question for you about how you think right right-sizing evaluation to the stage that the solution is at. For example, we worked with the Gates Foundation on evaluating some EdTech products, and it was meant to be a two academic term evaluation, but after one academic term, it was clear we needed to call it. And so we didn't invest in all of these levels. And so I'm curious to hear about how you think about right sizing, and even if you could share with us what comes next after some of these succeed. Does GSMA think about scaling and helping them to reach further?
This is a great question. I could talk for hours, but I won't, don't worry. So I think this is something we think about a lot, not just with our AI-based grantees, but with all of them. The reality for the grantees that we fund is oftentimes our solutions that they're putting into market, the minimum criteria is you must have a solution in market, but it doesn't need to be in market for a long time when you come into the grant cycle. So there's a lot of examples where our grantees might put a solution in market 1 month into the grant. Now, at the end of 18 months, there's no way we're going to be doing a full-scale evaluation on the impact of that. And a lot of it will be dependent on the sector that grantee is working in. We've had a lot of grantees in digital utilities, for example. Very difficult to find the impact of digital utilities and access to different services when those services are going through government in an 18-month time period. Our typical rule is that in 2 years, we go back and we do some kind of engagement with the grantee based on what's happened to the solution. So because these are for-profit entities, sometimes they close. And there's a lot to be learned there in, why did your business fail? And was that a tech problem? Was it a funding problem? Were you not able to raise series funding? What happened? And sometimes the solution has scaled and we have a really meaningful opportunity to do something. And then it's very helpful because our grantees often will use that data to pitch for investors in the future. So we get a lot of cooperation and engagement with the grantees when we come back at a later stage to say, we now want to evidence the impact of your solution. In terms of the current set of grantees that we have that are AI funded or AI based right now, we think about this in a couple of different ways. At the beginning of the grant cycle, we group them by user base, which is the first indication of where you may be able to do a larger scale evaluation. Because again, as I say, some of them come into the grant with 100 users. So already you're thinking this is not something I'm going to be able to do. For the ones that we know have bigger ones, so I'll give an example of this edtech that we're working with in Ghana. Really interesting solution, very large scale service already. They had about 65,000 users coming into the grant cycle. And what we're funding is an AI-based solution to reach offline users. So USSD and IVR in rural areas. It's a good candidate for evaluation, but the first thing we sort of think about is again, what is the role of the AI in this? We already know that students accessing educational support in an offline function is helpful in preparing for their exam preparation. But what is the role of the AI? So we did a lot of work with them initially to sort of say, okay, let's really isolate this and then look at triggering the impact. We initially were going to do an RCT or a sort of a revised RCT, similar to what you're discussing, where over 2 or 3 terms we would come back, we would test. But what we found when we sort of opened the box on the AI solution is that the structure of the data at the back end wasn't sequential, which meant you couldn't track how a user is progressing through the system. So we had to go back and sort of say, okay, how is the model functioning? Can we set up the model so that in 3 years we might be able to come back and look at this again? And so that kind of product first focus was really helpful in this case. So then we have this angle. The biggest challenge that we have, and then I promise I'll stop because I could talk for a while, is the 2 or 3 solutions we have that are B2B or business to business in business model. Particularly our deep techs. And this is sort of the world that you're working in, Emeka, around language accessibility. Very difficult to evaluate that because what you're looking for is a very indirect impact where the end user is coming through another company in our case. So thinking about, okay, how do we approach this? What are the proxies that we're going to be using? And to be honest, we're working through that now. So one of the deep techs that we're working with is a company called Wisyak, who does language accessibility in Nepal. And one of their clients is an agritech that we've worked with in the past. And so they've agreed to sort of support Wisyak in understanding the impact of their services. So can they speak to their end users, because they have a robust enough user base at the end of the grant cycle to sort of say, okay, now how has your interaction and engagement with the specific services that you were already using improved or detracted because you're now doing it in your local language? We're hoping to learn from that approach and see how we might be able to apply it to other deep tech situations where we're not going to have that level of access. So it really is case by case. And what we have learned after several rounds of digital tech and AI now is to meet the grantee where they are and the solution where they are, because otherwise you're not going to learn what the impact of the solution is anyways. It often will take the time to sort of mature and then to just double check what the sort of robustness and validity of the product is that underpins it.
Amazing. I think we have about 0 minutes left, unfortunately. So, but we'll stick around. And really thanks to Ruth and Emeka for all their great work. And also, I think just really pushing the thinking in the sector forward. So yeah, thank you.